Which is the best university in the world, and which universities should you consider studying at? In this video, I'm going to focus on the academic ranking of world universities, which is one of many rankings to help you to determine which university you might consider studying at. I'll go through which universities come out on top, and whether the ranking even makes any sense, methodologically and intuitively. And it turns out there are some significant methodological issues with the ranking that we're going to need to go through. And that's what I'll be looking at in this video. Now, on the topic of learning and education, I'd probably encourage you at this point to check out Skillshare. Skillshare is an online course repository where you can learn myriad different skills, from web development through to finance through to pretty much anything. There's a course out there for whatever you're interested in. And I've personally created a course on calculating a firm's stock beta, which is necessary if you're going to calculate the firm's expected return and therefore to value a firm. But if you're not interested in finance, there's a whole lot of other things as well you can check out. And I'll leave my link in the description below for you to look at that. And if you sign up using my link, you'll get a month of free premium content. And free stuff is always good, so check it out. And with that out of the way, let's have a look at the academic ranking of world universities. So here we are on the academic ranking of world universities. We basically have a list here, unsurprisingly, going from top through to bottom. Now, if we have a look at our top 10, it is largely intuitive, although one can dispute or debate about which university should really be at the top versus others. So coming out on top is Harvard University. That's relatively unsurprising. Then we have Stanford immediately below it. One could argue about exactly which US university should come out on top, but that's where they've put those two. Then the next one we have is Cambridge, then MIT, UC Berkeley, Princeton, Oxford, and Columbia coming in number 8. Now, in general terms, those top 8 are good universities. You would not be surprised to see them toward the top. Then we have Caltech and University of Chicago. Now, rounding up the top 20, we have Yale, Cornell, we have Paris-Saclay University, which is a surprising top contender here, in that intuitively speaking, if one is considering where to study, it's probably not at the top of your list. Even if it is very good, it probably is not what most people are considering. Then we have UCLA, Pennsylvania or UPenn, Johns Hopkins, UC London or University College London, and UC San Diego. Then University of Washington, and then University of California, San Francisco. So what you can immediately see in your top 20 here is a lot of the top generally makes sense and is genuinely intuitive. However, some of it is a little bit weird. For example, Paris-Saclay. Is that really going to be above University of Washington, for example? Because it was coming in, if we have a look down here, at number 13. But is it really going to be better than University of Washington or UPenn? I'd hazard a guess that many people would go to UCLA or UPenn over Paris-Saclay. Similarly, with University College London, many would go to University of Washington over it, just as some examples. So we're seeing some rankings here that are not super intuitive. However, in general terms, it made some sense, but there is some weirdness going on. And part of this could come down to how they're calculating the ranking and their methodology, which I'll get into in a second. Now let's have a look at how this sorts between countries. So many of my viewers are looking at studying or are based in the United States, the UK, and Australia. So let's first focus on the United States. This is going to be largely what we saw before, albeit with the French and British universities weeded out of the top 20. So much as we had before, we have Harvard, Stanford, MIT, UC Berkeley, Princeton, Columbia, Caltech, University of Chicago, Yale, Cornell, UCLA, UPenn, Johns Hopkins, UC San Diego, University of Washington, UC San Francisco, Washington University in St. Louis, and so on and so on. And you can see if we scroll down through this ranking, that it kind of makes sense, although you'll see some things that are a little bit weird. So for example, we've got some weirdness with Rockefeller University. Now it's very specialized. The reason it appears at this really high ranking is because with some super specialized universities, this ranking, the ARWU, tends to give them a little bit more benefit than they should. The reason I say that is with super specialized universities, sometimes with some of the ranking criteria, these are kind of excluded for some of those universities. So they end up appearing higher than they should be. Or sometimes because they're so focused on one field, they end up just hitting the dot points that feature heavily into the ARWU ranking. So you'll end up with some weirdness there. For example, number 48 in the world, or number 28 in the United States, is the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas. Now, that's a brilliant medical center. I have no debate that that is an excellent place. What I would say, however, is that it would not be 28th in the US in terms of a university. It's obviously super specialized. So to my mind, that's a little bit weird that it would appear so high. We'll see a converse in a second. I'll circle back around to this. But in the social sciences, the specialized universities tend to do absolutely terrible, in part because of the methodology, which penalizes places like London School of Economics or London Business School or INSEAD or Singapore Management University or the like. So that's effectively what we're seeing in terms of our ranking in the US, in terms of our top 30. Again, sort of intuitive, but there's definitely some weirdness. Now, if we have a look at the United Kingdom, again, sort of intuitive, but some weirdness. So we've got Cambridge and Oxford at top. That's probably relatively unsurprising. Then after those two, we have University College London and Imperial. Now, those two would generally be regarded as strong universities. Then after that, we've got Manchester. This, in broad terms, is probably going to cohere with what most people would expect to be the top 5 in the United Kingdom. So I'm not terribly surprised by those numbers. If we keep scrolling down, though, we'll probably see some things that people will have maybe some debates over. For example, King's College does reasonably well, and it probably should. But then Bristol, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool. I mean, one can always argue about where these should be sitting. Now, it seems that these are all grouped into the same band. The thing is, they're grouped from band 101 to 150. So identifying the exact rank is slightly tricky, and they're all given a joint rank right here in the UK. That means that when we're doing this list, they're often sorted in a way that is slightly arbitrary, i.e. alphabetical, which makes some universities, Warwick for example, look significantly worse than others. So that's what we're seeing in the UK. In general terms, the top 5 for the UK makes broad sense. However, if we have a look here, Cambridge and Oxford, they're separated by 4 places, which is big at this point. Cambridge is 3, Oxford is 7. And this is not always super stable, because we can see this in 2021. But say we were to look at 2020 and go back to the United Kingdom, what we'll see here is a little bit of instability. So for example, Oxford was a little bit lower before, University College London and Imperial, again, similar types of rankings. So we've got a little bit of instability, but not egregiously bad. So back to 2021 ranking. So that's what we're seeing in the UK in terms of the best ones here. Then after this, we have Edinburgh. Now, in terms of places to go here, one could well argue that Edinburgh might be better regarded than Manchester for some people. The reason I say that is, if you were to choose where you would go, maybe you'd prefer to be in the best place in Scotland over the 5th place in England. That could be a strong argument and possibly a valid argument, and something that one would want to consider. But in any case, that's what we're seeing in terms of the rankings that are emerging in the United Kingdom. One thing that I do want to emphasize that is incredibly weird is really in relation to London School of Economics. And also, I'd note in relation to London Business School. So London School of Economics does extremely badly in this ranking. Comes out 151 to 200 in the world, 15 to 20 in the UK. That I would regard as a very weird ranking, because London School of Economics is very strong in social sciences. So for example, economics or law or other social sciences. But by virtue of how the methodology works for ARWU, and I'll get to the methodology in a second, by virtue of how it works, universities like LSE are disproportionately penalized. Furthermore, if we look at this ranking, we can see London Business School does not factor into this at all. London Business School is nowhere on this list. This is a problem, because London Business School is probably the best place for an MBA in the United Kingdom. You would prefer to go to London Business School over pretty much any of these other places for an MBA, or indeed for a PhD in finance, or for many other business-related qualifications. However, as you can immediately see here, London Business School is not in the UK ranking at all. This creates a bit of an issue, because it immediately tells us that they are disproportionately penalizing some types of universities. Now, if we go over to Australia, we can see again somewhat intuitive rankings, but again, there are some issues that arise. So, for example, our top three, strangely, is now Melbourne, Queensland, UNSW, or University of New South Wales. Now, UNSW is a good university. It's overtaken University of Sydney at the moment, both of which have overtaken ANU and Monash. So that's what we're seeing in our 2021 ranking. Now, bear that in mind, and let's have a look at our 2020 ranking. Now, in our 2020 ranking right here, and we'll go back to Australia, what you can immediately see here is ANU was actually much higher. It's fallen behind UNSW and Sydney. So we're seeing a little bit of instability. One can argue about whether that's because the other universities did so much better, or ANU did so much worse, or whether it was just a weird quirk. But in any case, when you've got a country or a location where sometimes some of the data is thinly populated, you can get quite a lot of volatility. And that's an issue with this ranking, because they disproportionately rely on things like publications in Nature and Science, which can be thinly populated in some locations, which creates issues. But in any case, that's what we're seeing for 2020. Now, if we go back to the latest ranking here, we can continue on and have a look again at Australia. So, continuing on here, we have Monash, then Western Australia, then Adelaide, then Curtin, then Deakin. Now, I mean, in broad terms, it's sensible enough. However, one can well argue about exactly where these universities should rank compared to one another. And in particular, in different departments. Some universities might be disproportionately better than others in some departments. For example, in business, UNSW clearly dominates University of Queensland. However, University of Queensland is very good as an overall institution. So you will see some issues there. So that's what we're seeing in terms of very top. If we continue further, we can see some of the other universities as well. For example, Deakin, Griffith, James Cook, etc., etc. And it's a broadly sensible-ish ranking. However, one can definitely debate about exactly where each of these individual universities should place. So that's what we're seeing in Australia. Now, I mentioned before that London Business School was excluded from the UK. We can see similar types of things happening in Singapore and France. Now, Singapore I mentioned because of Singapore Management University. So if we go to Singapore, you'll see Singapore Management University is not here at all, whereas the Duke NUS Medical School is for some unknown reason separated as its own institution here. If we go over to France, you'll see that INSEAD is missing. So under France, you'll see several universities, some of which are very good, but you'll see that if we keep going down, INSEAD is nowhere to be seen. Now, INSEAD is definitely one of the best business schools in the world, and certainly one that anyone would consider for an MBA. However, as you can immediately tell here, while we've got Montpellier Business School, we have no INSEAD. Again, a very weird quirk. And it's something that the ARW would need to iron out. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the rankings that are emerging. The next question, of course, is, does this ranking make any sense? What is the methodology for this ranking? And is it something that is potentially going to give us weird results? To see that, we're going to need to look at the methodology for the ARWU. And it turns out it is quite strange and leads to some very, very weird quirks. So here we have the methodology for the ARWU. Now, in broad terms, the general items they look at make sense. Quality of education, quality of faculty, research output, per capita performance. Those things all seem to make some sense. But how they're assessed does not make sense at all. For example, quality of education. The measure is alumni winning Nobel Prizes or Fields Medals. That excludes social sciences to a large amount. There are Nobel Prizes associated with some social sciences, but disproportionately fewer than hard sciences. So automatically, you're cutting out a whole lot of social sciences and making it significantly more difficult for universities that emphasize social sciences. Clearly, that is a problem and leads to huge weirdness in the rankings, and is going to disproportionately favor those universities that focus on natural sciences or general hard sciences. Furthermore, Focusing on alumni that have won doesn't make that much sense. Because let's face it, the alumni who win, part of that will be due to the education they received. But a good portion of it is going to be due to the support that they got from their institution after they left. So I dare say this isn't even really a good measure of alumni quality. Rather, they should perhaps measure how many of your alumni are in the top echelon of the business world in that country, or have achieved other accolades that are deemed to be relevant. What they have here is a very narrow definition of alumni achievement. This furthermore continues into how they are measuring quality of the faculty. Staff that have won Nobel Prizes or Fields Medals. That again makes no sense, particularly in many departments and in areas where social sciences are emphasized. Again, not particularly helpful as a methodology here. Another problem with this is that it leads to the issue of universities just paying a certain sum of money to get a Nobel Prize winner on their books. Even if that Nobel Prize winner doesn't really do very much at that university, and even if that Nobel Prize winner has very little to do with the university in general, it just leads to that type of situation arising. The next one is highly cited researchers. In theory, that sounds like it should make sense. The problem with that is how they define it. They define it by looking at some index from Clarivate that defines highly cited researchers. The problem with it is very weird and is not intuitive. For example, in Australia, in economics and business, there is one person on that list, literally one in the whole of the country. And while that one person has published a lot, he certainly would not be in the top names you would think of when you would think of economics and business. There are myriad people who have published in top tier journals, much more than he has. So it is a weird definition here as to how exactly they're getting at this. Rather, they'd be better off looking at field-weighted citations or field-normalized citations, rather than looking at just some arbitrary index of number of highly cited researchers according to someone's list. They could access citation data, which would make a lot more sense to look at the citations themselves. The Leiden ranking does this. It's not clear why ARWU doesn't. In terms of research output, again, papers published in Nature and Science, like Nature and Science continually, again, disproportionately harms some institutions. Then we've got here number of papers published in the Social Science Citation Index. Emphasis here on number of papers published. Again, why? Like, number of papers published doesn't make sense. You should be looking at the quality of the papers published. You could look at the citations. You could look at, for example, the weighted average impact factor that's going into these, perhaps field weighted so that everything's normalized by field. That would be an example. That way you would be factoring quality rather than just arbitrary measures of quantity. Then per capita research performance, again, doesn't make much sense, because now you've got university gaming, who's counted as a faculty member and who's not. And you end up with this weird gamesmanship about who is actually kept on the books as a faculty member, who isn't, how is everything counted for the purpose of this ranking. It creates a weird system where universities are effectively playing around with who's on their books here. Furthermore, from the pure perspective of academic prestige, no one really cares about how many people are employed at the university. They care about the output. So per capita doesn't even make that much sense. Rather, one would be better off looking at citations and the quality thereof, as opposed to per capita performance. So there are a whole host of issues with the methodology. They detail their methodology in a bit more detail in their definitions. However, this largely just reiterates what I just mentioned. So overall, the academic ranking of world universities is informative. It helps to tell us which universities have come out ahead in 2021. It's mostly intuitive, but there are some very weird quirks. And I dare say the methodology does not make very much sense. The methodology seems to disproportionately weight nature and science in arbitrary ways, Nobel Prizes in arbitrary ways, while for unknown reasons, ignoring citations. For unknown reasons, ignoring, for example, the impact factor of the journals in which people are publishing, ignoring the quality of the broad preponderance of research, and just focusing in a very narrow manner on specific indicators. So for that reason, I would regard the academic ranking of world universities is having some significant problems. And in any case, those are my thoughts on it. If you have any thoughts about the ranking, or any thoughts about which universities are the best ones to go to, or if you'd like me to cover any other rankings of this nature, let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, of course, if you're looking for ways to build your skills, both academic but also non-academic, for pretty much anything, check out Skillshare. And if you use my link in the description below, you can get a month of free premium content. And free stuff is always good, so check it out. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in, and I hope to see you for future videos as well. Bye.